Some of the fine points that underlie really good design, especially designing with an image, like to use a grid in publication design and on web design. You know, I showed you some of the ads that you're going to be building that are built on grid units. A grid is like a strategy that you choose for a particular publication. It might be completely different grid for another project. And it's kind of like an invisible glue that holds a design together. So it might be like a framework for a house. And you're setting up in your design. Let's say I gave you an assignment to design an entire magazine. Well, you would want to come up with some strategy for what's going to hold it together. It's like a roadmap um, for your viewers to follow. And I think we think of very simple grids like a newspaper, like this is 6-column grid. And then they've made that main photograph 6-column units, right? They didn't make it like 5.5 or 4.25. They used that grid space. And then very simply, and they're filling up most of the space, you know, each of the legs of type is 1 grid unit. Up at the top, those little highlighted elements are 2 grid units each. The photographs are 2 grid units. So this is a really simple grid. And they, again, have filled up all the space. And Pachia's point about the white space, I think, is really important. Here's a magazine out of San Francisco area. And I think it's like 9 grid units on each page. And they've used 13 grid units for this photograph. But then over here, they've been very strategic about how wide their text is. So the little pullout quote or the little caption in the center is 1 grid unit. The columns of text that need a little more size to it are 2 grid units. The headline at the top is actually 3 grid units, so they've written it to fit. And yet there's a lot of white space in this design. And then they use that, that same column structure throughout the publication. Again, the little caption with lots of white space around it. Even this very free-form illustration, I love that little map. That is 3 grid units and 2 grid units for the text. So you can kind of see that even though it's there, we aren't aware of it as a viewer, and it's not a straitjacket. It actually makes your designs a lot more flexible by creating a grid structure with lots of units. And I'm gonna give you a couple of examples. So the more columns you create, the more flexible your grid becomes. And you might decide that a 1/2 column space will only be used for like little tiny text, like agate text or a caption or graphics data. Or a piece of text or an image can fill 1 column or it can go across several, but you still have that structure that holds it together. And with white space, not all of the space has to be filled. So here's a magazine that I designed years ago. And even though this is very free form, I mean, we would go into the studio and take photographs, I would design things on a grid. The text would fall within a grid. On inside pages, this might be a left-hand page. I had all of this white space, but I had an underlying grid. And I always used 1 grid unit of space between things that weren't related so that it just kind of seemed like it was floating out there, but I didn't have to guess. I didn't say, oh, I'll move it over just a little bit, you know, otherwise it would become kind of chaotic. And you can see that the text at the bottom, Secrets from the Pros, I left that white space to the outside. I didn't try to line up all the bottoms of that because I thought it looked a little more interesting just as it ended up, okay? But I had this underlying grid. And so you can introduce a lot of white space strategically. And a lot of times, magazines really incorporate white space. And you can see that these are all very different, right? But they're drawing your attention to a caption or a photograph or a headline because they've left some of that white space intentionally.